Good afternoon or good morning to wherever you may be zooming in from. I'm Rachel Messerich, the Editorial Communications Manager for the American Craft Council, part of our editorial team and the coordinator behind the American Craft Forum series. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to this American Craft Forum program in association with our quarterly publication, American Craft Magazine. I'm speaking to you today from my home in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and representing the offices of the American Craft Council in Minneapolis, which are both located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. This place carries a complicated and layered history. In the thousands of years the Dakota people have been in relationship and kinship with the land here, and in the several hundred years since European settlers colonized the land that the state of Minnesota now occupies. The United States land seizure was a project of destruction that denied the Dakota free and unhindered access to land that fundamentally shapes their identity and lives. We pay tribute to the Dakota and Ojibwe and invite you to consider the land on which you live and the confluence of legacies that bring you to stand where you are, particularly through critical reflection and conversation with your own community. Fostering conversation and community are at the heart of ACC's mission, and American Craft serves as one of the most vital contributions in service to this mission and hopefully to the field of craft and American culture. Our world continues to change, and so we continue to do what we can to meet this moment. This year, American Craft Magazine celebrated its 80th anniversary, and we are using that time to reflect on when and where this publication has been at its best. Rooted in the present moment, shining a light on the diversity, resilience, beauty, and impact of American craft and its makers. In 2021, we embraced the year in four themes: nourish, flourish, kinship, and wonder. We started the year needing some nourishment. We reached for opportunities to flourish. And now we look to the communities that we've built and those that have built us in order to dream big for the future before us. Before I dive into the program and my introduction, I just want to thank the ACC staff, particularly our editors, Karen Olson and Roseanne Pereira, our amazing marketing team, and our IT guru, Jason Samuels. The American Craft Council is a national nonprofit organization. As such, I would also like to give a big shout out to our donors and members who make programs like this possible, and a very special thank you to the Minnesota State Arts Board and Wingate Charitable Foundation for their generous support. A few technical and logistical reminders. Please make sure that your cameras are off and your audio is muted for the program and conversation. We encourage you to participate in the talk via the chat feature and drop any comments or questions there. Closed captioning is available during this program. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a closed caption symbol. Checking that button will turn this feature on and off. The program will also be recorded and available for future viewing. In the fall issue, which is all about the ways that we find kinship with ourselves, with others, and with the objects around us, we were so pleased to feature an incredible story of collaboration across cultures, across mediums, across disciplines. For what is collaboration, true collaboration, if not a form of kinship? As writer Angela Rasdin finds out through interviews with the Stone Barns art fellow Gregg Moore and the 4 chefs in residence at the Stone Barns Center for Food and Agriculture, collaboration is a multifaceted relationship that requires effort, communication, and mutual respect. Important elements in any relationship between people and made evident in these creative collaborations. Today, we are thrilled to present this conversation between ceramist Gregg Moore and one of those incredibly talented chefs, Omar Tate, as a microcosm of what successful collaboration can look like and feel like. And now, to help us dive more deeply into this concept and to introduce us to our 2 speakers, I am so pleased to welcome the fantastic Angela Rasdin, who I invite to turn on her camera now for a quick introduction. You'll remember Angela as the writer behind our powerful State of Craft piece from the summer issue, Unearthing the Craftscape. Angela is a Minneapolis-based writer and editor and the digital director of Experience Life magazine, a progressive whole health publication where she also served as senior editor for Health and Nutrition from 2005 to 2014. She has also worked as a senior editor for the Etne Reader. In More Than a Plate, her feature story in the fall 2021 issue of American Craft, she tells the story of Gregg Moore's collaborations with chefs, including Omar Tate, at Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture. Please join me in welcoming Angela. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I'm really looking forward to this conversation between Omar Tate and Gregg Moore. When I first interviewed them for the American Craft piece on chef ceramist collaborations, I figured there'd be big differences between them. Omar is a chef, Gregg's a potter, but I was really struck by the synergies between them. Not only are they both artists, but they're both researchers and readers and just very thoughtful people. So I'd love to introduce Omar Tate. Omar, if you want to turn your camera on. Hi, Omar. Omar is a chef, artist, and co-founder of Honeysuckle Projects, a multifaceted food company that focuses on the nuanced cultures and cuisines of the Black diaspora. Omar has emerged as a visionary and a leading thinker on the restaurant industry's cultural development as a whole. He specifically focuses on race and ethnicity to tear down structural barriers through his practice in Honeysuckle, his pop-up cultural concept. In 2020, Honeysuckle was named Pop-Up of the Year by Esquire magazine. And this year, Time magazine named Omar as one of the 100 innovators to watch as part of their Time 100 Next list. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you for having me, Angela.
And then I'd also love for Gregg Moore to turn his camera on so I can introduce him. Gregg is an artist, designer, and educator. His studio practice explores the relationship between ceramics and new media, drawing from historical foundations while questioning and investigating perceptions of the ceramic field. His current work includes ceramic tableware and mixed media sculpture that examines the practices of gardening, farming, cooking, and eating. Moore received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Geosciences from Skidmore College, and his Master of Fine Arts degree from the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. He is also a professor of visual and performing arts and director of the ceramics program at Arcadia University. And welcome, Gregg.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, before we get into the specific pieces the two of you collaborated on, I would just love to start with a general question. Omar, when you participated in the Chef in Residence program at Stone Barns, you created a multi-course meal that reflects the Black American experience from the transatlantic slave trade to police brutality. And obviously the focus of the program was on food. But when we talked, you said that collaborating with Gregg ended up being your favorite part of the entire residency. And I just wondered if you could talk a little about why.
Sure. Well, first I want to just state, well, thank you, American Craft Council. And thank you, Gregg and Angela. But you know, we didn't set out to create a menu that explored the breadth of that experience that way through 8-10 courses. It just kind of happened that way. I write poetry a lot, and a lot of the themes that were exacted in the menu came from poetry that I've written, literature that I've read, research that I've done. And immediately when I met Gregg, understanding that that's how he approaches his work, it was really through the many conversations that we've had about things that were unrelated, largely unrelated to the actual residency itself. We formed a unique bond that I think, you know, you mentioned that, you know, you thought that these would be very contrasting or maybe polarizing perspectives, me as a chef and Gregg as a ceramicist and steward in the art world. I think that I'm just like the anti-chef, you know, where I very much downplay the food aspects of my work because the food is really just like the platform for more things, or the vessel for more things to be explored.
And Gregg, you know, you had talked about, do you feel the same way about your role as a potter, or that you downplay? I mean, you've talked about how it's not about beauty for you. You're trying to get to sort of start from a deeper meaning. I mean, do you resonate with what Omar is saying in terms of how he approaches food as a chef and how you approach your art?
Yeah, very much so. I think, and that was, I think, presented immediately when we first met and started talking. was that it was really about the ideas. I mean, the objects and the actual food, the particulars of both came much later, and we kind of got lost in exploring ideas first. And so, and hopefully we can illustrate that today. The work, the collaboration, and the works as a result of that collaboration really forefront those concepts. Hopefully, where the ceramic object and the food tell a complete story.
That's great. And I know, one thing you said, Omar, in terms of telling that complete story is that, as a chef, I mean, part of this residence program was that they had the resources to hire Gregg and to, have all these things that usually chefs don't have at their fingertips. But that as an artist, you've really always wanted to create a 360 experience for someone who's eating your food. It's not just about the food, but there's, you're trying to create a story. And can you talk a little about how working with Gregg helped you get closer to that 360 experience?
Yeah, I before the Stone Barns residency, I think that I've made maybe 1 or 2 attempts of using plateware or ceramics as a way to contextualize the story for very particular dishes. And it was actually Chef Dan who connected Gregg and I, who just so happened to live pretty much in the same city, where I'm about a 20-minute drive from the studio. And he asked us to connect well before the actual residency, which I think afforded us the opportunity to explore the vast ideas that we were able to explore. I think that more than anything, in the conversations that Gregg and I had, he helped me to really understand how expansive ceramics and the practice that he applies to his craft and his work is just much more vast than I ever anticipated. The first dish that I'd ever done where I was trying to use a plate or a ceramic was called Remnants on the South Philly Stoop, and I bought the closest thing that I could find that looked like slate or concrete from this. I can't remember the name of the store, but it's like the Dutch version of IKEA. There's like 3 of them, and it's like IKEA meets Five Below. It's a weird store, but they had these random slate plates, and we bought like 200 of them. They're very cheap, and we served a crab with a piece of the Philadelphia Tribune on it, and just to kind of like keep it short, we it was called Remnants on the South Philly Stoop because it's supposed to represent the things that are left after a block party, but also within the scope of the plate, we were exploring how migration patterns show up in modern places of joy and Black existences. So that was that plate, and I think that was the plate that Gregg maybe first saw of my work, and that might have been the kickoff of our conversations.
Yeah, and let's bring up the first slide actually, because the first slide is a dish called Black Lung, a terrarium for Black breath. And this was sort of, the dish Remnants on a South Philly Stoop that you just mentioned, Omar, was kind of the precursor to this dish, right? So, you got the closest plate where you could get from the store in New York. But now when you guys connected, what we're looking at is, Omar, you've talked about how the dish you created kind of represented Black lives lost in conflict in 2020. And so the two of you, Gregg and Omar, together made a plaster cast of the actual sidewalk in front of your mother's house in West Philadelphia. Can you talk a little about how this idea came together? Gregg, had you done this kind of casting work before, and what position that place kind of represents in your work as well?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I will just maybe add to what Omar said. When Dan introduced us, it was months before you started cooking there, and having that time to have the conversation develop was extremely valuable. I don't think this would have happened without that luxury of time. The cast of the sidewalk did emerge from the Remnants piece. Or dish, I should say, that Omar was talking about, which I think it was the first visual of your food that I had seen, and I was immediately hooked. about that idea of serving food on, well, you were using slate, but it represented the stoop. And I've been making the dishes for Blue Hill at Stone Barns for some years, and one of the dishes that I make is actually a cast of the farm, and the farm at Stone Barns, and I've done it in several different seasons, so different temperatures, and the soil looks different every time it's been cast, and then food returns to that surface from which it's grown in its presentation at the table. So Omar's dish and the visual of Omar's dish and the idea behind it got us to thinking about taking that concept of casting the surface of the earth at the farm in that case, and applying it to a more appropriate texture and cast to the idea that's in the food dish. So the ceramic dish and the food dish being of that same locale. And so this is us casting one of the three. We did three different dishes in a triptych that you see on your screen on the right. And you served the same dish on each of those casts, right, Omar?
Yeah, it was pretty much the same. It kind of changed depending upon what was available from the greenhouse at Stone Barns. But for the most part, it was a salad of several different lettuces, herbs, a radish, and then underneath the entire salad were chicken bones. So the idea about the plate is it's multi-layered in that one, there's the contrast between what takes place in Tarrytown, New York, and Stone Barns, and what takes place in urban sectors throughout America, but specifically here in Philadelphia, and that there's this extreme value of the life that grows in the soil in Tarrytown and Stone Barns, which represents agriculture on the whole, in the way that we perceive it romantically, but then also like not romantically, the life that exists in urban sectors, largely where Black folks and people of color exist. And so I wanted to show, and I think that I didn't realize this until you said it, Greg, that because the plates themselves are all a singular tone with varied texture, that it kind of makes everything equal and everything equitable on the surface. And it's really truly the salad that works in contrast of that equitability. And so the salad and the chicken bones themselves represent a life force in the Black body on the plate. And the bones on the bottom represent a spiritual representation of life that takes place during funeral ritual ceremonies, particular to voodoo and voodoo practices. But then the greenery of the salad itself and the chicken fried mushrooms that were also in the salad represent the life force that exists in the urbanality of Black folks in a sector of America where we didn't choose to be, we were forced to be. Prior to the Great Depression, somewhere around 90% of African Americans lived in the South, primarily on farmland. And this plate represents that removal and the continued existence of Black life in urban sectors.
And were you able, we talked about this in our interview, Omar, that I didn't know there were chicken bones below that dish until you told me. Were you able to see diners and see how they reacted both to the plate and the word puka, as well as when they're eating the salad and they get to chicken bones? Like, did people know what to do with it or make of it? Is there feedback that you can share with us?
Sure, yeah, the feedback, most people were like surprised to find chicken bones after they finished eating this lovely, beautiful, bountiful salad. There's this like marker of death, right? Or just non-existence of life. And every single ceramic in the triptych has a marker of the human hand or human intentionality in the plate. So like the name Puka just represents a person who wrote their own name, or any person who could write their own name and assert their existence. There's a cigarette butt in one of the plates. I think it's the plate third from the top or first from the bottom, however you're looking at it. There's a cigarette amongst soil and algae and rocks and concrete, and then the lane of bricks is the other example of the human hand in urban settings where like the life force, the natural life force of like greenery and grass finds a way amongst human manipulation, and then on top of that, there's the conflict of human life that takes place in urban sectors, largely as expressed in the menu here. Where ingredients would be are names of those who we lost from police violence, state violence against black bodies in the country.
Great, and then it actually looked like a terrarium. I mean, it actually looked fogged up. Was that the steam from the chicken fried mushrooms, or how did you achieve that look?
Well, yeah, it was the steam from the chicken fried mushrooms. So when they hit the table, the terrarium was actually foggy. When they took it off, it was almost as if the dish was exhaling its own breath, which was another thing that kind of just happened. It was not planned at all. It just happened, you know.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to go to the next slide to talk about another dish that you guys collaborated on. The dish is called Notes on a Black Pantry, and there it is right there. And it's served in plateware that's inspired by Kalanaware, which is a type of earthenware pottery that was made and used by enslaved people during the colonial period. And so what you see there is that first part of the slide is actually, Omar, I assume that's your hand, and you talked about how you read a book called High on the Hog, and there were just a few lines about Kalanaware. I think you also mentioned that when you and Gregg first talked, you both almost mentioned it at the same time, like, have you heard of Kalanaware? And you both broke out into a big smile and realized like you were going to be friends long beyond the residency. So can you talk a little about, and I know you've said that if you've ever had a restaurant, this is sort of the inspiration you wanted for all the dishes, but yeah, can you talk a little about the inspiration behind Kalanaware and why you chose to serve this dish in fragments?
Sure. This is just another example here where like my thinking was just like very, very direct and very linear. My chef brain working that I learned about just in those few lines that are underlined there in the book High on the Hog. I learned about Kalanaware. I did research on Kalanaware, and I almost wanted to just replicate what I assumed Kalanaware would look like, whole and intact. But it wasn't really until the conversations that I had with Gregg, who really respected, I mean, I'll let you speak on this more. He really respected the fragmentation of it and thought that was the whole. And after hearing him speak on that, it opened up a whole new world of possibility that I think we're going to continue to work through and towards as much as we can. But yeah, I would love for you to touch on why you thought that was important.
The fragmentation?
Yeah.
Well, I think I really do remember that in my studio, we almost said the word Kalanaware at the same time, like we were thinking about it as we were discussing the first piece. And I think this emerged second so the order is actually accurate in terms of how we develop these or how we consider them in development. And I have made and continue to make plates that look broken, but for different reasons. Just sort of on a visual level, I like the exposure of a broken edge. I like how it gives the viewer or the diner access into the object or the dish that they're not able to get if it's intact. And Angela, you mentioned my background in geology, and I think it has a lot to do with that, the sort of learning about a material through the way it breaks, and learning about landscape through the cuts in that landscape, and being able to sort of see the stratigraphy of geology or geography. And so that, I mean, that's more of an aesthetic concern. And I think where this piece really started to develop was thinking about it through the concept of taking fragments and purposefully making them whole again by being able to use the different parts of what looks like a broken dish, even though it's intentional, and it to come back together at the table. And I think what's really exciting is the way Omar uses flavor to do that. It's visual texture through the food, but also flavor. And in a real way, it's an opportunity for the person who's eating out of the dish to then engage with it physically. And I wonder, Omar, if you could talk about the spice in the shard, and how the person eating off of this place, this plate, engaged with it, and became part of the narrative in that way.
Sure. So the thing about Notes from a Black Pantry, it's an ongoing investigation. It's almost always a salad that I've done several times in different seasons using different ingredients. In this case, the photo that you see in the bottom left of your screen there is a still life, so to speak, of the kitchen counter of different things that my wife cooks with. So the dish itself are fragmented pieces of that kitchen counter made into a functional, just a very practical salad atop these broken shards. And the fragmentation of Black experience is what's being explored here through Kalanaware. And that Kalanaware is a material culture that's been recently being rediscovered in plantation archaeological digs throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and southern regions of the country. And none of them being found whole. I think it was you, Greg, that mentioned that maybe we should keep them not intact, because that truly is the story of Kalanaware. And when you mentioned that to me, it really made me think about going back to the book High on the Hog. High on the Hog only came together through fragmented pieces of Black history. The cabin spice, which is the spice that's on the broken shard there, was placed on the table when this course came out, but then remained throughout the dinner until dessert, because that fragmented experience that the enslaved had of actually, like, they only had a sliver of a true human experience, which removes them from several freedoms, one of which is just the freedom to even season your food in the way that you like.
And you were also saying these are spices too, the irony of spices that came over as part of the transatlantic slave trade, but then, that they weren't really allowed to use, or that they would use in secret in cabins or something. So the whole idea of having it out on the table and open to freely kind of use as you wanted to use.
Exactly.
And Notes on a Black Pantry, I remember, you said something interesting about Notes on a Black Pantry, which was also that part of this dish is that you realize when you first became a chef, you were kind of not going to the ingredients that were in your, like the sort of ingredients you grew up with.
Right. There was the thing about kitchens is that it's not even about, it's beyond racism to me. It's almost like being in the military, in fine dining kitchens. It's just about every person having a very specific function. It's almost like everyone's a machine. And so the idea of identity and culture and ethnicity is stripped from every single person in the kitchen, unless you are a European male, because primarily that is the cuisine, and those who have been exacting that cuisine, that is the cuisine of those kitchens. In many ways, whether it's historically or contemporarily, that's just how it functions. So for me to use dried spices like dried chili peppers or dried garlic or dried onion powder or things like that, which are staples that my mom used, or all matriarchs in my family use and continue to use while cooking, were frowned upon. And me approaching those items again, and then using them as a springboard for creativity was how Notes from a Blank Pantry started. So
I love that too. So integrating your chefy sort of side, with this, like with your experience growing up and like bringing that together at the table too. And, there's a lot of talk right now about authenticity and who can make art. And I'm struck by the fact that, Omar, you ended up conceiving of a menu that reflects this Black American experience. And you collaborated with you, Gregg, who's white, who actually made these dishes inspired by Kalanaware, which was made by enslaved people. do either of you have ideas about who can make certain types of art, or how maybe the process of collaborating across, you know, not just disciplines, but races and ethnicities might fit into this conversation, or based on your collaboration together? And Gregg, you can go first.
I was going to say, we've had long conversations about this, Omar and I. I don't know if we've answered any of the questions, but we definitely have discussed them, and continue to. I don't know. I think I would say that the maybe that's not a very satisfying answer, but this work wouldn't emerge, it wouldn't take shape if either of us weren't part of this collaboration. And I think to the nature of collaboration, that back and forth, you know, that I think we've been talking about the term collaboration and the use or misuse of that term, and the idea, it keeps coming up that true collaborations have a power dynamic that is equal or equitable. And I think that's true with the work that Omar and I have been doing together. As to authorship, I think intentionally none of the work is signed. So it's not, either of our names aren't on them. We're going to get to the last piece that does have a mark on it, but it's not either of our signatures. And I hope what that suggests is that it's both of ours and neither of ours, that these ideas aren't owned by either of us. You know, particularly we're looking at the colonialware work here. Certainly not, that idea is certainly not owned by me. And had it not been for working with Omar on this project and for this dish, I wouldn't be making this work.
Right. What about you, Omar? Do you have a take on, you know, who can make art, how collaboration fits into this, specifically the two of you collaborating on something like this that draws from these historical precedents?
I think authenticity is complicated. I think it's a word that is now currently being overused. When you think about authenticity and the root word being authorship, there should be a distinction between creativity and ownership. There's nothing more authentic to me, to humanity, than creativity. That's really what separates us from, you know, other species, among other things. But to be able to write your own name, to be able to create art, to be able to contemplate your environment, those are all these ephemeral feelings of creativity that humans occupy. So in terms of collaborating with anyone, I think, you know, the real word that we're looking for, that I've been trying not to say, is appropriation. One is understanding the roots of something and exploiting that. What took place between Gregg and I, and hopefully what takes place through any great collaboration, is that there's a mutual respect for the creativity and the artists involved, and the culture, if any, which is almost always the case, that's being explored. I feel like we met that and succeeded with that, because I mean, just because I'm Black, creating ideas based upon Black history doesn't make the work that I'm doing authentic. There are people who challenge me to this day about barbecue that I serve, or historical context that I use, but I really use history as just another means to express my perspective on experiences and ethnicity and race.
Yeah, and you said something when we talked, which I thought was so great, which was, you know, talking about your specific experience. You're talking about, I'm not West African. My grandfather wasn't a farmer. Like, I have this very specific experience as, you know, growing up with your mother in Philadelphia, and just trying to drill down on like your story.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, if I were to pursue my endeavors through the path of what quote unquote authenticity is, I don't think we'd be sitting on the Zoom right now, you know, because I'd probably be making biscuits and, you know, just traditional Southern dishes, and not dishes that are really nuanced and granular when you consider Black culture.
Right. And before we move to the next question, I did just have a quick question for you, Gregg. When you are, when you are working with something like a Kalana inspired dish that has this history and this story, like what is your process for research before you get in the studio, or how does that work? Like how does that work before you start actually working with your hands?
Well, that's kind of always on my mind. I actually teach a course on how cuisine, agriculture, and ceramics have co-evolved throughout globally in various ceramic traditions. And I think it's a starting point for almost everything I do, which is why it was so seamless for this project. Yeah, I mean, resources are readily available for this sort of research. It's a little more difficult to go to museums these days, or was when we were doing this in late winter of 2021. And I also really, I mean, since we're talking about the nature of collaboration, I like collaborating with all sorts of scholars and researchers in other fields, art historians being one of them, and understanding their approaches to research it and taking that approach before entering the studio. Although I wouldn't say it's before. It's done in tandem.
Right, it's not so linear.
Yeah, and there's kind of a back and forth to it. Like when Omar and I were looking at images of historical examples of colonial ware shards, we looked at as much as we could, and there were discussions about material and appropriate material. The material that actual colonial ware is made out of wouldn't last the run of the residency in the kitchen.
Right.
So we needed to shift just for practical reasons to a different material, and then try to capture what it was and the quality of that material in the dish. And then the other thing I would add is that, like all of the dishes I make, the idea is that they don't get in the way of the food, that they support and help showcase the ideas embedded in the food. And so, you'll notice that the dish that we ended up making is just a singular color. It's monochromatic, where very few, if any, of the shards that we researched had just one color in them. And I hope what you can see in that dish is that it helps in the service of the food, just very based on basic visual levels, to not be too complicated. And that I got a little far afield from your question, Angela, about research, but I think the important part of that response maybe is that it's not linear, that research emerges from both the concept that we're pursuing, but also then from sometimes what happens in the studio, if there are mistakes or accidents or opportunities that you can only really get to through the actual doing of these things.
Yeah, I mean, that's how, and I was struck by when I talked to both of you for the article, and now I think you can tell you just both seem like you had such a smooth working relationship when you were collaborating. And was it so easy to meld each of your visions? Were there ever any disagreements, and how did you handle them? Or were you just always kind of moving in the same sort of frequency? Are there, Omar, and I also wondered if it was easier to collaborate with someone when they're not in your discipline. Would it be harder to collaborate with a chef, Omar, and versus a potter? I don't know if you had thoughts on just, were there bumps in the road, or how did you, get over them, or how have you collaborated with other, in contrast to how you collaborated with other people?
I think there were definitely, I don't know if there were disagreements, but sure, disagreements. There were varying ideas around, in particular, the shape of the colonial ware on the floor there that was set in the gallery was a conversation, a very thorough conversation that we had, I think, from the very beginning into how that was going to be displayed, whether it should be on the wall, on the floor. We went with the word flag always comes to mind when I think about Black experience. And so that wording kind of helped create the shape that we went with. But that's just one example of, several different conversations that, I mean, I think at one point there was a conversation around it being shaped around the silhouette of like my body on the ground, and like what that image would kind of like conjure in one's mind when they saw it. And I think that was something that I think a misunderstanding is a better word there in terms of like, this is where culture clashes, I think, like actually exist, where it meant something completely different to me than it did to Gregg when that.
What, like an outline of a dead body?
Yeah, like a outline of a dead body, of a dead Black body that did not make me feel very comfortable, but he felt like was powerful because it represented myself, and like to me, myself in the silhouette represents any Black death, So like it's things like that in collaboration, you can't be afraid of being wrong. I mean, I don't think that you should be afraid of being wrong if you're not collaborating, but most people are seeking perfection. And I think I can speak for both of us, and we kind of just touched on it, Gregg, and that perfection was never the goal. If you look at the plates, if you look at the nature of this work, we weren't trying to achieve any level of perfection. I think there was a consideration for serviceability, like whether or not these plates were practical for serving in a high volume restaurant such as Stone Barns, that sets such high standards for just restaurant service. But beyond that, it was truly about how to achieve that serviceability while still applying the research, the creativity, and the knowledge that we have, and the curiosity that we continue to have, and have all that represented in the serviceware.
Yeah, I mean, my favorite people are able to say, I don't know, which I think, Gregg, you said during this, like, I think I don't know is a very satisfying answer, because it's confident, and it leads to like, but I kind of want to find out, or, being open to that. And Gregg, Omar, I think, was the second chef in residence that you collaborated with. And I think now there've been 9 total, and I might have had that number wrong.
No, well, I worked with 4.
You worked with 4, okay.
Shola, Omar, Johnny, and Victoria. And then there were five more in the second season through late spring and the summer, okay. Who I worked with, but not directly. I didn't make the work. And just to go back to what Omar said about being wrong, I think in a healthy collaboration, you're not afraid to say stuff or to have ideas and suggest directions that might not work, or that might not be comfortable for the other person. And then on the other side of that, your collaborator, one of us, is also then not afraid to say, well, no, that's just a terrible idea, and here's why I think so. And I think that's really healthy. And so we distilled the work down to these 3 objects, or these 3 groups of objects for the 3 dishes. But there were at least tenfold the number of ideas that we explored that just didn't work as well. And having that comfort that we have with each other in being able to discuss ideas and being honest with one another, with each other, I think really helped the collaboration be a success.
I have a sense that just generally, culturally speaking, it seems like it's harder for people to do that, to be honest with each other in a way that might be viewed as negative. I mean, I don't think honesty is negative, but I mean, I think the fact that you guys can be honest with each other and you're comfortable, that led to so much of this. But do you find that most artists like are able to do that, or people? I mean, that's a huge thing to have that kind of intimacy and go from there. Like it's like a marriage or a relationship or something,
Yeah.
Omar, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead. It's so important now that I'd like, when I set out to collaborate with someone, it's like the first thing I talk about with them. It's like, just like, you can say anything to me if you hate what I'm doing, if it's just like terrible, just say it, and then we'll shift gears. And so I really encourage, I mean, like, without that, it's not worth pursuing, because it's just not real. There's the authenticity that you were talking about earlier, Omar. It's not authentic without that honesty.
Sure. I think in regards to collaborating with chefs, I think there's a lot less collaboration. When chefs talk about collaboration, it's usually two chefs coming together to make separate dishes for one meal, and oftentimes they don't always come across as cohesive. And to me, that's not true collaboration. That's just two people. It's more opportunity than it is collaboration. I think that between artists, it's quite different, you know. And just with this experience here, we achieved so much more together than I think we would have separately. Not to say that what we would have created separately would have been received well, and we probably having entirely different conversations. But I think this is I'm very proud of this work. It feels timeless, you know. It feels timeless, like the history that we discover and continue to uncover. And it was necessary then, and I think it'll continue to be necessary. And so this collaboration is some of the proudest work that I've ever been a part of.
And on that note, I'd love to look at the next slide. This is the last collaboration we're going to look at. So this is a piece called Sybil's Medicine Cup, and it was a collaboration not just between Omar and Gregg, but also Omar's wife, Sybil St. Aude. I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
St. Aude.
St. Aude, Sybil St. Aude, who is also a chef, who actually shaped this cup with her hands and marked that X that you see. And Omar, I wondered if you could talk about the inspiration for this dish. There's a book there called, with the chapter title called Doctoring Women. And I just love the story of how you even came to think about making this cup, if you wanted to talk about that. Sure.
I think I'll take back what I just said. This might have been the most confusing aspect of our collaboration, because it started out by me having this like idea of a purely utilitarian cup that's used for medicine. And when I expressed that to Gregg, he had no clue what I was talking about. And like in my head, I'm like, but it's right there, you can't see it. But
like you said, Gregg, like weren't you like, should it have a handle? Does it look, you're trying to visualize it? Sort of, what is this cup?
Me? Well, I definitely didn't think should it have a handle, because I don't love handles, but this took a lot. And I think that's why I love it so much. It really kind of, it took a lot of mental exercise to understand
why. So what, why did it take a lot of mental exercise to get to this concept?
Omar, can you just briefly, maybe not so briefly, just explain to me or to the group what it was you told me you wanted to serve in it?
So, well, I have to touch on the book then to describe.
Don't be brief.
Yeah, so the book is called Working Cures, and Working Cures is an academic study on several practices of curing, healing, and doctoring in plantation communities, pretty much from the perspective of those who were enslaved. And so the chapter here, Doctoring Women, featured a woman named Elsie, which is extremely important because you almost never read a text about enslaved individuals where an individual is actually named by name. It's almost just like this person or that person or whatever, if they call them a person at all and not just a slave. So the fact that this was a Black woman who was being described as a doctor and being named Elsie was extremely important to me. And it just so happens that my wife, Sybil, is also a children's book author, and she wrote a children's book by the name of Elsie. So reading that immediately brought me to her. Sybil's from Haiti, and in Haitian culture, voodoo and voodoo medicinal practices and spiritual healing practices are still very much alive. As it's described here in this book, the doctoring practices that were held by Elsie, that were practiced by Elsie, happened under the American practice of it's a similar name, hoodoo. It's related but unrelated to voodoo, which is very important. They're not the same, but hoodoo, which is also colloquially known in the South as root work, is how she doctored and nursed people back to health. One of those things was burnt whiskey, and burnt whiskey is what I asked, what we served in this cup. which is a concoction of whiskey that's been, I think, in French, it's like flambéed. You burn off the alcohol. She added different roots to it. And so we created a concoction of a whiskey where we didn't actually burn off the alcohol, but we did add herbs and root to the mixture and served it in this cup. And if you looking carefully in the book, there's an X marking on the underside of one of the materials there. There's an X marking on the underside of the cup that we produced, which was formed by Sybil's hand. Very important to me because the naming of Elsie in the book showed the presence of a Black woman human who was delivering health. And so the idea behind Sybil shaping the cup, who wrote the book Elsie, was that imprint would be what was delivering this whiskey to the customer at dinner at Stone Barns. So the X marking, we use that as the signature for this entire collection of work because of what we discovered here in this book, Working Cures. And
Sybil, your wife, did, she shaped the cup and she also marked the X. And
yes.
Greg, had you ever collaborated in a way where someone else was forming the actual piece? Was that new to you, or what role did you play then in this piece?
I think that I have. I'd have to think about how, but it worked in that way before. So, you can see that it's a bit of a challenge to try to get those ideas into a less than 3-inch tall cup, right? Little chunk of porcelain. And well, I don't really remember how I think it started by thinking about having the person holding the cup who's drinking out of it be able to touch and hold hands with Sybil, using the cup as the medium that interaction passes through. So I wanted to see if we could actually get Sybil's hands in the finished object. And the way to do that, I think, was to just have this lump of clay and then have Sybil shape it. And then I made a mold of it and then cast it in this very, very dark, almost black porcelain that's unglazed on the outside, so that if you feel and look closely enough, you can see some of Sybil's fingerprints in each of the cups. And so the presence of her hand, I love these series of images. You see the image on the bottom right is of Sybil making the X on the bottom of the cup. And you can see on the phone there's the image, the research image that is on the top of the screen. And it's a really small object. It's like 2 3/4 inches tall. And you can hold it in your hand and just sort of wrap your hand around the entire cup. And really, I hope there's that connection there with the hand of the maker, of the shaper of this form. I don't know. I think even though it is a very small object, we cast a whole series of these for service at Stone Barns. I think because of that size, it's potent. There's a density in the meaning of this object that I think is enhanced by how small and precious it came out to be. I would add that the material being porcelain was really important. I think in the success of this piece, I think it just functions, as Omar said, in the kitchen better because it's more durable, but also cups in particular are meant to be picked up and held in the hand. And Omar, was it a room temperature drink or was it hot?
It was room temperature.
Room temperature. There's a particular density that porcelain has that it takes on the temperature of the liquid that's in it, and that is then transferred into the hand before it's actually drunk by the person who's holding the cup. So I don't remember. Maybe you can tell us what my first idea was for this, but it wasn't this. And this really you know, it took a lot of back and forth, and I loved that because it was so much joy in this struggle, I think, to figure out how to make this.
Yeah, I don't remember I don't think there was an original idea. We were just like, I think in my head, if I had to just guess, my head was centered around like the Civil War and like tin cups and medicine and things like you know, set up in these makeshift hospitals and things like that. But it wasn't really until Sybil stepped into the picture and we just laid clay in front of her, and it really only took two rounds of attempts for this form to take shape. The first time, I think she actually like made a cup out of clay.
I left the room and I came back. Not what we had intended. In fact, I fired that. I have that for you guys. But you know, and so I realized I didn't explain the process well enough, and so we started over, and the second shot was, I thought, captured it. It was perfect.
Had she ever done that before? Had she ever, you know, done anything like this before, Omar?
I mean, I don't think so with any intention. We both played around with like clay at home, because I just have stuff. But I think there's something to be said about the intangible in the creation of this piece, you know, because it kind of, the research was applied to the personal, and the personal was Sybil. And as soon as she stepped into the picture, it wasn't even really about Gregg and I anymore.
You need to get the cerebral kind of, or you need to kind of disrupt the sort of overthinking, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even sure if it was overthinking or over consideration. I just think that she held she held whatever energy that turned this piece into what it was. Mm-hmm. Gregg and I were going back and forth of me trying to explain, and the idea wasn't really like, it was there, but it wasn't concrete, or porcelain, pun intended. And for Gregg, I think there was, you know, the practical approach to create how ceramics are created, but then the artist brain, I don't think that I was necessarily translating what I saw, and then what actually emerged was not what I saw at all. So I really think that Sybil was just, she carried the spirit of what this needed to be, and there's something to be said about the size. I love you mentioned the size about 3 different times, because of the exactness of the size, which I don't think was actually exact at all. When we think about it, the intentionality, the notes of the human hand are so present, that marking on the underside, we could only pour but so much liquid into the cup. The transfer of heat or temperature, like you described, if it was bigger or smaller in any direction, I'm not sure if all of that would be received in the way that it was. And so I think what I'm saying is that thank God for this, because I think that this is largely just the intangible.
I think as a final question, I just would love to know if you two, you know, since you've collaborated with each other, what did you learn about each other's process or experience that maybe you continued to, you know, that affected the way you approached your own art or the way you make art? And are you guys still collaborating or in touch? Or, you know, I'd just like to know first, like what you learned from each other that you took, you know, that you still have with you, and what your relationship is like now.
Omar, I'll go first. What I love about Omar is that when I have an idea and share it with him, you never answer. You say, let me think about that. And then it's like days later that we talk about it. So there's this real deep consideration of ideas. I mean, you take, you know, even if it's maybe a whim that I share with you, which I'm not sure I did, but you take it so, think about it so deeply. And I really respect and respond to that in a way, like sometimes I think I answer too quickly. And I think, yeah. So anyway, so there's that. And then hopefully we'll continue to work together. Yeah.
And Omar, was there something like, what did you take away from the experience of working with Gregg that sort of struck you, or you kept as part of your practice, or you want to do in the future?
I certainly want to continue to work together. I mean, we've had several conversations post the residency that's materialized to like absolutely nothing, but at least we're still in conversation about stuff, which is exciting. Working with Gregg, kind of like, I've described myself as an artist to people, but it felt like validating working with Gregg in this experience. Just because what we didn't mention during this was that I also made like 6 other pieces of art while collaborating with Gregg and creating the menu for Stone Barns. And I'm not always the most confident person in the things that I do, because like I didn't go to school for art, and like I've never shown it in any galleries or anything like that. And in this event with Stone Barns, we actually created a gallery for the ideas of this menu to live on their own. And it was just a very intense period of time in my life personally. And this collaboration and this work being like so exemplary of all the different aspects of like what went into this menu. Again, I mean, I've said it earlier, I'm very proud, and this just feels very, very validating as a creative person. So thank you, Greg, for that, helping me feel that way.
Oh, me? Right back at you.
Well, thanks so much to both of you. I think this was great seeing you and talking to you again. I think Rachel's going to step back in to close the show.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us for this conversation. Thanks so much, Gregg and Omar and Angela, for being here, for taking the time to kind of do a deep dive into your collaboration and kind of how it's sort of shaped you both, as artists and creators. So we really appreciate your time, and we appreciate everybody's time. Again, this recording will be available for future viewing, and we'll be saving the chat, and we'll have a whole slew of resources. So thanks again, and enjoy your week and afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much.